Dousquilt is a partnership project between Wild Resources Limited and Clwys-y-Goedwig, the Community Woodland Association for Wales. Over the last few years, we've noticed an increasing interest in foraging the collection of wild plants for personal use. The idea behind the Dousquilt project is that commercialisation of some of these forage plants could perhaps provide an income opportunity for small woodland owners, including community woodlands. As part of this, we have been investigating how to develop sustainable harvesting regimes and management plans for wild plants, and we've been looking at wild garlic in particular as a case study. Wild garlic is one of the most popular wild foods in the UK. It's widely featured on many websites and in foraging books and wild food cookbooks. Alongside the instructions on how to make pesto and soup, there are often advice given on where and how to forage it so that the picking of the wild garlic can be sustainable. However, foraging of small quantities for personal use is quite different from commercial harvesting. For a start, harvesting wild plants for sale is illegal without the permission of the landowners, and large quantities needed for sale should also be underpinned with a management plan, because the amounts taken are more likely to damage the population than just harvesting a few leaves. There is a basic set of steps and investigations which need to be done to prepare a management plan. Now, this might look like a long list, but it's not as bad as it might appear. Most of these can be easily done with simple investigations and careful record keeping, which we'll now demonstrate. The first step in preparing a management plan is to gather together as much information as you can about the species to inform and help design the work that you need to do. There are many different sources of information that you can use. There are websites, and the popular websites on foraging are a good start. There's popular books on foraging, and there's other books more about the ecology of the area, and there are also many scientific papers. Ideally, try and look at all of these, but don't fall into the trap of thinking these will all agree. These are all quite different perspectives. It's important that we critically examine what's available and use this information to design our investigations of plant density, growth rates and behaviour in your particular woodland. Our study was done in a local woodland with a large expanse of wild garlic. Here we're in a deciduous woodland that's natural regeneration of ash and sycamore and elm that's grown up in an abandoned clay pit. As you can see, it's got a very rich ground flora made up of huge swathes of wood anemone, bluebells, we've got ferns, we've got lots of celandine. We've been mainly looking at the wild garlic because there's lots of it. We need to know the area of wild garlic in our woodland. To do this, we did a quick survey of our woodland based on the Dousquilt Woodland Survey protocols. We lay out a regular 50 by 50 metre grid across the woodland, and at the intersections of the grid lay out a 2 by 2 metre plot in which we measure the amount of wild garlic. For our particular woodland, we had 20 plots. And of that 20, we found that 5 contained wild garlic. Take the average wild garlic cover per plot, 0.1665, so we multiply it by 5 hectares, the area of the woodland. This gives us 0.83 hectares of wild garlic, which is actually 17% of the woodland area. The next step would be to find out how much wild garlic we can harvest from that area. So for this, we need to calculate the density of wild garlic within the areas that has it. The statistic we need for this is the average weight of leaves per square metre. Once we have this number, we'll then be able to estimate the area that we need to harvest to get a 10 kilogram load, or what we might get if we harvested 5 square metres. To be able to determine the density of wild garlic, we laid out some 0.25 square metre quadrats. For this we used metal frame quadrats because they're easier to handle. And we laid those out in the dense sward where we had 100% wild garlic, and then we clipped all the wild garlic within the quadrat, put it into a plastic bag, brought it back to the office and weighed it. And we did this for a number of plots. The average weight of leaves in the sample plots that we clipped was 1.466 kilos, or approximately 1.5 kilos per square metre. So we multiply it by 0.83 hectares. It gives us just over 12 tonnes of wild garlic in the woodland. This is very impressive, a huge amount, but not actually relevant to our harvesting question, as we'd never condone stripping the whole woodland at once to get that yield. What we need to know is the amount of leaves of the best size and quality which we can sell, which means working out both when the leaves are best and also what proportion of the material harvested is actually saleable. The best way of doing this would be to have repeat test clippings across the harvesting season, so maybe every week for a couple of months, and also to grade the cut material by leaf quality and size. These data should help you optimise the production of wild garlic from your woodland. So let's have a closer look at some of this wild garlic, see what we can understand about how the plant grows in a square. So there we have it. So this is the turf that we just dug up from the woodland, which represents a clump. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tease it all apart. When you actually pull it all apart, you see there's actually lots and lots of many different plants of a whole range of different sizes. This looks like a seedling. So we've got the seed, which has just germinated, and it's put out a little radical, a little root. So anything up to about that size could be like a new seedling. See this one? It's about the same size as one of the seedlings, except look, the leaf is broader, but at the bottom we haven't got a sign of the little seed. What we've got is a little tiny bulb. So this actually is the next stage on from a seedling. This would have had 2 leaves, and you can see from there that leaf would have been a lot bigger than this one, a much bigger bulb, and then these 3 big coarse roots. This is the next stage. We've got now 2 big leaves, we've got a flower stalk, we've got this long skinny bit which is kind of like the bulb. See, we've got these hairs down at the bottom, and this little thing here. They're the leftover from last year's bulb. So now we've got 3 leaves, and we've got 1 flower stalk, and it's produced a baby one down at the bottom here. See, they're joined. And this has got 2 leaves and a stalk. And now look how many of these big coarse roots we've got. And the biggest one, we've got 4 of these daughter bulbs, which is actually quite a big plant. And then this will be 8 years old. They reckon that 10 is as long as any of these individual plants live. So the thing which is most remarkable about it is that what looks like a clump is actually a whole population of plants of different ages. Dissecting the turf samples allowed us to count the number of plants in each size class. Results from just our 2 samples show that there is a lot of variation. Here, what appears to be a clump was in fact an area where seeds were likely to be washed out, so the remaining adult plants had plenty of room to grow. And this is where the plant with 4 daughter bulbs, the very large plant, was found. The turf sample is more normal, with a high density of young plants, as shown in this set of 3 different turf samples. A healthy population of wild plants should generally have very many more young and small plants than larger ones. In the turf samples, we can see that the bulbs are tightly packed with the bigger ones deeper in the soil. How does this happen?
So at the bottom of this big coarse root here, you'll see it starts to produce lots of fine little roots. So it grows down. These very fine roots, which are all twisty, go sideways from that main root into the soil around it, twizzling around to give a really, really good grip. And when that's got a really good grip, this section here, which is smooth and hasn't got any side roots, will contract so that it will anchor itself down here and it will pull the plant into the soil.
There is obviously a life history for wild garlic plants. What we can see is that wild garlic, despite being slow growing and relatively short-lived, can come to dominate an area. The key to this being the prolific seed rain, coupled with the ability of the young plants to survive tightly packed in with adult plants waiting for their turn to flower. In the absence of grazing animals and other disturbance, wild garlic can gradually take over, and we've seen in our woodland that there are extensive areas of very, very high densities of wild garlic that forms a monoculture. Long-term monitoring of forests in Germany really highlights the way wild garlic can gradually take over the whole forest floor. This suggests that wild garlic is pretty resilient, and there is likely no chance that you could eradicate it from your woodland, however hard you harvested it. However, you still need to manage it respectfully and carefully if you want to harvest sustainable quantities for many years. If we are going to harvest large quantities of plants, we need to understand how the plants themselves will react to being cut and how long it will take for the cut patch to recover and return to pre-harvest levels so that we can have the same yield again. The most direct way to do this is to harvest some trial plots and monitor their progress. Here is the 0.25 square metre quadrat that we clipped in April 2019 when we were estimating the density of leaves per square metre in the woodland. If we take the quadrat away, you can get a better idea of what the cut area looked like, and you can see there's lots of little plants and all the large leaves have been removed. We went back a week later to see what had happened. And as you can see, there's very, very little difference. There's just a nice square hole in the developing wild garlic sward. We then went back a few weeks later again to see what had happened, and again there's very little difference within the plot itself, but now you can see outside it's all nicely flowering. A year later, now you can see that inside the plot the plants are all very small, whereas outside the plants are obviously a little bit bigger. This is obviously not an ideal time of year to try and assess the difference between the cut plot and the uncut areas because the plants themselves haven't yet fully developed. It probably would be easier if you go back later. So here is one of the plots that we completely harvested in 2019. So this is 2 years since this was harvested. And you can actually see, besides there being fewer flowers, that the overall height and size of the leaves within it are actually lower than they are outside. So here's the grid square that we used initially to cut the plants. See that goes down to about that level before we hit the top of the leaves, and down here we're going to that level. You can see there's about that much difference between the two, which indicates that the plants within the square are likely younger than the ones outside.
It's now a year later, it's the 29th of April 2022. If I put the quadrat back in position, you can see that superficially the wild garlic doesn't look too different from outside the quadrat. However, if we have a closer look, it does look very much as if the density of the larger leaves, the older plants, and the flower stalks is perhaps somewhat less. We've just done a very quick count of the number of flower stalks within the quadrat and without, and what we got inside was about 21 flower stalks, and just randomly choosing an area outside we got 45. It's at this point where if we wanted to continue to track the recovery of the cut quadrats, we would have needed to have done a full quantitative survey counting the density of stems of different sizes from the beginning. However, even without that, I think we can still say that 3 years after harvesting, there's still an observable effect on the sward. A different approach to commercialising your wild garlic might be to host guided wild foraging walks and charge for them, or you may simply wish to invite people to come and forage in your woodlands as an interesting event or activity. Picking on such walks will most likely be done using conventional foraging practice, which is to pick small amounts from several locations as you wander through the woodland. If it's just a few people, that might be fine, but if you're taking a large group through doing this, from a management perspective, you may wish to consider what the impact of having all of these people walking through your woodland might be. So mostly this revolves around considering the impact of trampling rather than the harvesting itself. If you walk through the wild garlic, you will see that it's very easy to crush. It doesn't really like being walked on. And if you crush the plant, it doesn't recover. Here's the area that we demonstrated a couple of weeks ago, and you can see that the footprints and the crushing of the plants that we did has not recovered at all. If you really wanted to bring large parties of people through to go foraging through an area like this, you might have to think quite carefully about where you're going to allow them to walk and whether you want them following a single footpath or whether you're happy just letting them wander wherever they wanted. It's not huge amounts of damage, but it is something to bear in mind. The heart of a management plan is what is termed the management prescriptions. Prescriptions are the rules for harvesting and are based on what you know of the plant's horticology, which is the life story and ecology of the plant itself. The prescriptions, the rules, should always be somewhat precautionary, which means you should leave a good margin for error because our knowledge of the plant isn't perfect. The management plan itself should also be adaptive so that you can get started even if information isn't perfect, and that you can improve your prescriptions, the rules that you want to use, as you learn more about the plant. Based on our investigations of wild garlic so far, my interpretation of a precautionary starting point for prescriptions might be to cut larger quantities from blocks to avoid excessive trampling, to maximise the efficiency of your harvesting activities, and so that you know where you've cut so that you can properly allow for recovery. I'm thinking that we should also leave cut areas for perhaps 4 to 5 years so that there's been at least one season of heavy flowering to replenish soil seed stores before cutting again. Perhaps harvest in strips, say 1 metre wide, with uncut areas between the strips, as the seed doesn't travel very far from the parent plant, usually only as far as the flower stalk collapses, which is only about 30 centimetres. Foraging practice advises cutting stems close to the ground so the bulb can produce a new leaf. However, we've seen that the plant you are harvesting will very likely die as it only produces 1 or 2 leaves, and so there's not much material left behind to produce a new bulb. So it may be better to consider cutting higher up the stem, say just below the leaf, as this might reduce damage to the younger plants which will supply the next harvest. In summary, there are a number of investigations you need to consider when drawing up a sustainable management plan for a wild species.
We hope this example with wild garlic helps demonstrate how the process works and how you could apply it in your own situation.